Welcome back. Tonight we look at the legal process for dealing with rape cases. Every 2 minutes, someone is raped in the United States, more than 230,000 people every single year. Yet 90% of the attackers will never spend a single day in jail, and you will be shocked to learn one of the reasons why. RFL conducted a special investigation into the massive backlog of sexual assault kits, or commonly known as rape kits, back in March of 2012. This is where medical professionals collect physical evidence from a rape victim's body. Lengthy, painful, and as we learned, a traumatic process for the victim. Yet despite all of this, many of those victims, after consenting to it and going through it, never see justice. And it's not just because it's hard to sometimes cast this perpetrator they don't know. It's also because so many of these kits never even get processed. Reports say as many as 400,000 kits are awaiting testing or simply just sitting in storage. The reasons? Well, they range from cost, an average of about $1,200 to test a kit, to police and prosecutors simply deciding not to process them. Now, there have been some recent efforts by states and the feds to clear the backlogs, and we will talk more about that in our following segment. Still, we were shocked to learn about the hundreds of thousands of these kits that are just sitting untouched gathering dust, and we could only imagine how victims would feel when they assumed that, once they consented to the kit, it would be processed and they'd be seeing if there was a match somewhere in some database for that offender. Well, we wanted to see how they would feel about this revelation. As part of our investigation, we spoke with a woman who knows that feeling all too well, Natasha Alexenko. She was just 20 years of age in '93 when a gunman forced her into a building and violently raped her. For an entire year after that, police questioned her, seeking details that might help solve the case. But in reality, none of that really mattered, because the most critical piece of evidence, that rape kit with the DNA, never even sent to a lab for processing. Take a listen to Natasha's story.
In 1993, then 20-year-old college student and part-time veterinary hospital worker Natasha Alexenko was sexually assaulted at gunpoint by an unknown attacker in her apartment building in New York City.
As I put my hand on this door here to enter, behind me was a man who pushed the door open further. I felt a gun to my head. He showed me that there was a bullet in the chamber, and he put it to my head and he said, "If you scream, I'm going to kill you." I really made the assumption that since I was seeing his face, he wasn't wearing a mask, that I wasn't going to come out of that alive. There was a gun, there were bullets that I saw on the gun, and this was not going to end well for me.
Natasha says she initially had no idea that her attacker was going to rape her. She says he demanded they go to the rooftop of the building, and on the landing, just before the roof, he forced her to remove her clothes. He rifled through her pants pockets, stole her change and her keys, even her uncashed paycheck.
As I'm standing there naked and afraid and scared, and it didn't hit me what was about to happen, he, at that point, pushed my body. There was like a railing, and forced me to bend over on the railing, and I can't tell you whether he took his clothes off too or how it happened, but he proceeded to rape me. It lasted probably about 45 minutes. It was a horrible ordeal. It was being pushed around as I was weeping and crying, with the gun constantly pointed to me in one area or another, and he forced me to perform acts on him. And we think of things like, did you scream? Again, it's all about survival, and for me, I thought, well, okay, maybe if I give him this and what he wants, maybe I will come out of this alive. And I did. I did come out of it alive.
Natasha survived the brutal attack, but soon faced another challenge. Immediately after the attack, Natasha and one of her roommates were rushed to a hospital in an ambulance. Frightened and scared, the two women waited in a chaotic emergency room for what seemed like hours. She says she doesn't remember when, but at some point, she fainted. She woke up hours later in an exam room.
It's not a good feeling. You had just been raped. You feel that everybody knows what's just happened to you. You feel like it's written all over your face.
At that point, Natasha agreed to allow a medical nurse examiner to perform a rape kit.
A rape kit collection is similar to a very invasive gynecological exam, and it's an arduous process. Essentially, my body became a crime scene, and it was the way of collecting forensic evidence at the hospital, DNA, fingerprints, all that sort of evidence in order to eventually catch my perpetrator. So to have gone through that sort of thing in order to help the police with the investigation, only to find that the kid had been sitting for 9.5 years collecting dust in a police locker is extremely frustrating. It turns out it could be all for nothing. I assumed that everything I had done was moving the process along and we were getting closer to finding my perpetrator, including taking that DNA evidence that was in the rape kit to help find my perpetrator. I had no idea that that was not the case.
And I want to remind everybody here who we have at the table, because they can speak to this from interesting perspectives. Dan is a former criminal prosecutor, again, specializing in cases of domestic violence and sexual assaults. And you're also involved in an organization we've profiled in this program, Hope Store, an amazing group providing services to victims of domestic abuse. And also Assembly member Shelley Mayer, who has sponsored a number of bills dealing with sexual assaults. Let me deal with rape kits in a second. For the victim to show the courage to consent with all the challenges that they deal with, and to go through that and to find justice so elusive in many ways, in a different way, albeit, but it's a victimization twice here. I mean, you hear that woman's horrible story, and the least we should do is to do everything we can to try and catch her perpetrator, right?
Absolutely. And the saddest part of her very courageous testimony to me is you put your faith in law enforcement. You've been victimized by this person. You go to a hospital, which is viewed as a caring environment. You consent to this, and you believe in your heart of hearts that the police are in it for the right reason and will do the right thing. And to really be betrayed by the criminal justice system, even more than the perpetrator in some ways, it's such an offensive affront to our ideas that we have a system that works. This is a system that does not work.
No. Dan, you've been intimately involved in this. And I should say, it's gotten better in New York. There's a lot of places in the country that are way behind. New York City particularly has made improvements. But this is a dollars and cents issue. But again, put the face. The victim has enough courage to come forward here. A lot don't, right? They come forward and they consent to a very probing and invasive procedure. They assume that that kit is getting processed. They're matching it up with databases. Talk about the calculations that go on whether or not to even process the rape kit.
It's unbelievable that there is this backlog. Detroit, for example, found in an evidence room over 11,000 rape kits back in 2009, and some of them were a decade old or older. They started going through them, and they've identified almost 100 serial rapists from going through the rape kit, where you could identify semen, hair, saliva, other DNA
it's just
evidence.
Sitting there.
Yes.
And these guys could have reoffended in the meantime, victimized someone else.
And I think it's really important what you talked about how invasive and uncomfortable this process is. And when I was trying rape cases, I would often explain that to the jury, because the defense would sometimes say that the victim was making up the accusation. And I would really stress, look what they had to go through. Not only if they supposedly made it up, they voluntarily went through this horrible process of being probed by all these swabs and by a strange person sitting in a strange room, being asked all sorts of questions about your personal sexual experience. It's such a tough process to go through.
Right after you're raped.
Exactly. And I would argue to the jury that that corroborates the truth of what most of these victims are saying, is that they were sexually assaulted. And sexual offenders very often reoffend again and again. And by matching up DNA, you might not be able to identify the person who attacked this particular woman, but maybe the DNA matches DNA from another case where they did identify the perpetrator. And then you could link them and you could say, okay, this person's responsible for multiple sexual attacks. And that's how you build the case and you prosecute and take people off the street and lock them away.
And before I run out of time, again, the presumption from the victim, she articulated is, I figured they were processing it. The statute of limitation concerns, you don't get this guy in 10 years, it compromises the case. But more than that, the feds have finally made some money available, but it becomes, I would imagine, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Who's got more money, who doesn't have more money appropriated that'll determine whether or not you have a better or worse chance to catch the perpetrator. And you're putting police in the position to say, she might have been drunk, it'll be a hard case to prove. Or, you know what, she knew the assailant, that's going to be a hard one. That's not the way it's supposed to work.
But Richard, here is where it is so important that there's leadership at the local police level. And I see this in the city of Yonkers and in the other communities. The department, whether they have the resources, they may not have the resources. And then they got to go and fight for the resources. It's not an excuse to say we don't have the resources. Leadership requires, when the going gets tough, you don't have the resources to process it, you got to have like a sit down with your mayor that says, we are absolutely must have this, and we're going to go to war to get this.
That's where you use the media.
That is what leadership is about. There's absolutely inexcusable that there's not resources.
We've got 15 seconds left. I'll give you the last word.
Well, this is a public safety issue because when these are not tested, not only is the trust of that victim violated, but also that offender is out there to offend again and again and sexually assault other people. So this is a major public safety issue. Fortunately, there's been a lot of private and public dollars trying to alleviate and deal with the backlog, but still a long way to go.
And honestly, it's a national shame if we don't fix this. Dan, Assemblywoman, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. See you Monday at 6 p.m.